I'm really excited to tell you about AI and the future of cancer treatment, but let's start with a brief overview of what artificial intelligence actually is. What if we could learn from every single patient that walks through our clinic doors, every tumor, every molecule, every outcome? That's essentially the promise of AI. Artificial intelligence is simply assigning and attributing what we normally consider to be human intelligence to computers and machines. But at its core, it's essentially just advanced pattern recognition at massive scale. We take data to start with, but many different kinds of data, from imaging, voice, text, language, CT scans from patients, proteins, drugs that already exist and are FDA approved, as well as some drugs that have failed along the way. And then we process that data. And yes, it really does simply usually come down to zeros and ones. The data is then put into different types of AI models to allow for pattern recognition, simply beyond what humans often can recognize themselves. And then this allows us to make predictions or to classify different objects. So for example, is this a cancer? Is this not a cancer? Is this patient high risk or low risk? Is this patient likely to respond to therapy or not respond to therapy? Different models are better suited for different types of data. So we have certain different types of architecture that are best for imaging, certain types of architecture that's best for human language, and certain types of AI architecture that's best for forecasting or time series data. But AI today enables computers to learn from data instead of explicit instructions. So what do I mean by this? You could traditionally program something, for example, if the temperature reaches 72 degrees, turn on the air condition. But AI works differently. We don't program it with explicit rules like that. We just program it to learn. So instead of telling it when to turn the AC on, we'll tell it to learn what your preference is. When have you turned the AC on yourself in the past? Do you have a different preference in the day, during the night? And so we program to learn. And there are different kinds of ways that AI can learn. Sometimes we give it labels, like this is a tumor, this isn't a tumor. And then when it sees new data, it can then classify them. But other times we actually don't give it any labels at all. We just give it the raw data and we let it naturally cluster the different groups on its own, again through pattern recognition. And then we as scientists can figure out why it clustered these different groups together. There's also something called semi-supervised learning. That's when we give it a little bit of labeled data and then a lot of unlabeled data to do the learning on its own. And then reinforcement learning, which is pretty much what it sounds like. We reinforce it if it did something right, maybe give it a ding if it did something wrong. And then finally, and probably most revolutionary, has been self-supervised labeling. That's kind of why we have things like ChatGPT today. Essentially, it creates the labels itself. And so modern AI can learn from an enormous amount of data, which is why it's been exceptionally well at helping us model cancer. So cancer is biologically complex. That's why we really are in a great time where AI technology has finally allowed us to deal with this complex biology. So cancer is something we think about on a multi-scale. So from DNA that's mutated to dysregulated proteins to how the cells misbehave to the tumor microenvironment to how different the cells inside the tumor are, as well as the actual patient and outcomes. We think about cancer throughout this entire continuum. And AI is very good at developing models for each of these different types of data, as well as models that take in all this type of data. So AI can integrate this data and learn from the complexity. So I'll start with talking about some of the models we're building around some of this data. So for example, the tumor microenvironment, it actually consists of more than just the cancer cells. We care about the host immune cells that may or may not have infiltrated the tumors. We care about the stromal cells or the supporting cells, blood vessels and whether or not the tumor is creating blood vessels to bring in nutrients to feed the cancer, as well as signaling molecules that are released. And so we first start by doing something called spatial transcriptomics. This is mapping cells in tumors. We take thin slices of tumors. We actually measure the genes, millions of spots captured where the genes are active. But it's not just figuring out what genes are on in the cancer. We're actually also keeping the natural architecture of the tumor. And then we can figure out which cells are communicating, which cells are nearby, and what genes they have on. So AI learns the spatial patterns in tumors, and it can actually tell us, once we give it labels of which patients, for example, had aggressive tumors or which patients responded to therapy, so that in the future, when we look at the spatial transcriptomics of other patients' tumors, we could predict how they're going to respond or if their cancer is going to be aggressive. So AI learns spatial patterns in tumors to predict how cancers grow, spread, and respond to treatment. We can learn information about the tumor microenvironment, like is it immune-rich? Is it stromal-rich? Does it exclude immune cells which are trying to help fight off the cancer? Or is it very aggressive and proliferative? And then what we do is we take these signatures and get really accurate predictions of how the patient's going to respond to different types of therapies we have available. Or unfortunately, if it's a waste of time to give them that therapy because they're likely not going to respond. Again, cancer is so biologically complex. We think about it on the cellular level. We also think about it on the patient level. Every patient generates massive amounts of data. So if you think about it, from the day of diagnosis throughout, we capture data from blood tests, from scans, from genomics. But imagine if we also have this data on millions of patients. And so with that, we're able to create powerful AI models that can predict recurrence. When I say recurrence, I mean these models have been able to predict not just when the patient will recur or recur at all, but also where. We're also able to predict metastasis sites and when. And again, using these millions of patient data, we're able to predict if the patients are likely to respond to therapy or have a side effect. And we use these models to assess risk-benefit. So for example, if the patient is likely to have a severe side effect and we don't think it's going to shrink their tumor, it's usually best to avoid that therapy. And so these toxicity models, we're testing them now to see how accurate they are on prospective patients. So AI is helping us move from reactive cancer care toward predictive and personalized medicine. So as I mentioned, we think about cancer on very many different scales. But when we look at the proteins, this has probably been one of the most revolutionary ways we're thinking about cancer and AI today. Why? Because dysregulated proteins are where cancers generally emerge. They lead to uncontrolled growth, which is essentially the definition of cancer, evasion of cell death, metastasis, immune evasion, so escaping the host's actual immune system, and genomic instability. So we use AI to model the actual protein structure and folding, because that's usually what we do when we're trying to design a drug. So we use these AI foundational models to understand the biological context, how the proteins interact with one another, how they fold, and then also try and figure out new drugs that can fit into these pockets. So our AI models can predict how these proteins fold, interact with other proteins, how they're signaling, binding different drugs, and their dynamics. Then we use AI for the next step, which is to rank the types of drugs we should actually synthesize in the lab and test. So how do we know if AI got it right? Well, it always has to come back to the wet bench, the experiment. We synthesize the drugs, test them in vitro, validate them biologically, and then test them in vivo in mice before clinical trials. And so when I started drug discovery, it would take 5 to 7 years to get that first drug candidate, that lead drug. Now it takes months. And so already in the lab, in just a handful of months, we've developed 2 lead drugs that are hopefully going to change how we treat cancer. We prioritize these tough targets that have been considered undruggable in the past. We model the targets in silico, meaning in the computer. We design these new drugs. We also use AI to predict their activity and selectivity, and then we synthesize them in the real world, test them, and advance them to mouse models. And so with that, I'd like to finish with what the future of cancer care looks like. I think for every patient, we will be developing computational simulations, so digital twins of cancer patients. This will allow us to test how the patient is likely to respond to different therapies, how their cancers may grow, without actually having to test them on the person, so that in the future, we would just be offering patients drugs that are most likely to work for them. We also believe that the future of AI will lead to personalized and adaptive treatment. So right now, when we prescribe a medication to treat someone's cancer, it's based on clinical trial data, which generally is data that shows that a drug works in a general population of people that we tested it in. But it doesn't mean it actually works for everybody. It's actually very rare to have a clinical trial work in 100% of people. But our goal is that in the future, we won't waste anyone's time with a drug that isn't actually going to work for them, and that we'll only be prescribing them drugs that are specifically likely to work for them on an individual tumor and individual patient level. In addition, probably with the next advancement in AI, and I was having a discussion earlier with someone, manufacturing also has to catch up too, so many technologies at play here. But we believe will also lead to rapid AI-guided drug development. So a patient will come into your clinic, will be able to see what type of drug they need, even if one isn't out there already, and be able to produce it for them in a pretty short-term amount of time and get it to them if that's what they need. And so we have the AI models to individualize different types of treatments, but we need other sectors to also catch up. And so we envision that the future of cancer care will lead to longer, healthier lives, personalized predictive care, and a better quality of life. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all, and I'd like to ask Ari Daniel to join me for a nice Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I just want to remind everyone that I've got a few of my own questions, and I see some of you have already sent some questions in, but if you would like to ask Sophia a question, please scan the QR code and go to Slido, and you can input your question. Or if you'd like to go to slido.com and search for Reno Symposium and then input your question. Can you talk a little bit about how these approaches with AI can potentially help us predict before someone may be even showing symptoms or might come in for a scan and might go undetected? Can AI help us do earlier detection of cancer?
Absolutely, and that's probably one of the most promising sectors, because think about it. We always want to treat you at your earliest stage, right? No one ever wants to be treated at stage 4. The earlier, the better. And early screening has revolutionized outcomes. So we are seeing that with some types of screens, so if you get colonoscopies or if you get, mammograms, some type of CTs, AI is able to detect things on the actual scans that humans can't really see. Now, the issue is going to become how we can act on that, right? So we will always need clinicians' guidance. But imagine if you see something and you as a human aren't really picking up on a little speck of future tumor, but the AI is telling you something is there. We have models that are really accurate at that, but then what do? Right now, we're just bringing them in early for earlier surveillance. But until we have an intervention at that point, it's powerful knowledge. It will help with early detection because we won't wait till you're stage 3 to see it, even if it becomes stage 1. But what would be most exciting is if we actually can do something before it ever happens. So there's still a missing piece of technology there. But the earlier we bring you in and the earlier we catch you, the better the outcome always.
Given the incredible advances you just walked through, do you think that someone who might be starting in this field of cancer drug discovery or cancer treatment, do you think they could do it now without AI?
I don't think they'd want to. So when I started drug discovery, we would have to manually test all of these compounds. You know, I remember doing hundreds of these in the basement of MIT, and we didn't have AI at the time, but we did have robots helping us, we did have research techs helping us, but it was still so labor intensive, it was so expensive because you still had to synthesize these hundreds and millions of compounds that likely were going to fail.
Wow.
And I just remember saying this can all be done in silico. Like we can, if we have predictive computational models, we can skip this whole step.
You had a vision.
I had a vision.
Yeah.
And it was a painful one born out of late nights in the lab, right? But at the end of the day, if we could just end up only having to test maybe 50 compounds, that saves you so much time. So I think even biopharma, a lot of places now are moving to doing a lot of that work in silico. So it's almost unavoidable. We have a lot of software that we've been using already on the market that does really good physics and biochemical predictions, and I think AI is only making them more powerful.
I'm curious, James alluded to the fact that you've been coding for a long time. I'm wondering what kind of inspired you early on to go in this direction, or what were the kind of little breadcrumbs along your path that made you think, like, this is what I want to do?
Well, I think some people here at the Museum of Science are aware, but I was always obsessed with Star Trek growing up. So there was
Which one?
Next Generation.
Me too.
Yes, it was my
I've
favorite.
seen every episode.
And
I made sure of it during COVID.
Exactly. And, you know, I come from a pretty nerdy family, I have to say. My older brother is a particle physicist, so he was also obsessed with Star Trek. So coding wasn't really foreign in our household. So I always was into computer science, but I'm a chemist by training. I never actually thought the two worlds would merge until it made sense. So, you know, it's a very interesting, and I think most people are experiencing that now. Like whether you're in neuroscience, most people are seeing the applications of AI today. So I was just inspired by kind of being a nerd, but I never thought that it would actually be my career. I knew I wanted to focus on cancer, and I knew I wanted to focus on drug discovery, but finally the computational power caught up with us.
I'm wondering what it's like to be to be riding an asymptote. You know, I mean, you described a very different experience when you were at MIT doing this kind of work, and in just what you went through in your previous slides, it's a completely different. I mean, it's this incredible revolution, and so I'm wondering, what's it like as a researcher, as a scientist, to be participating in this field at this stage of its development?
So it's definitely exciting because you get to see things for the first time, things you kind of never imagined. The predictive power is just so amazing, but I also think it comes with responsibility. I do believe in some form of regulation. We have to care about our patients' data. You know, we have the honor of being able to train on so much data, but you do have to care about taking care of that and making it secure. But AI can also make mistakes. So people have to still be experts to know when to correct it. So it's very exciting, but you also have so many different, you have to worry about the ethics. You know, for example, some of these predictive models, you know, at first I thought every patient would want to know exactly when they're going to recur because knowledge is power. Well, when we talk to patients, some don't actually want to know. Some do, but some just think that leads to anxiety, that they kind of don't want to know. They have no interest in knowing. And so you learn that it's still very much a human problem that has so many different fields you have to consider. And actually, I recently learned that a lot of these really large AI companies are hiring philosophers and bioethical focused people. And I'm like, that makes perfect sense. So very exciting, but we have a lot to consider and a lot of work ahead of us.
That sort of touches on a question that we received from Anonymous, which is, what are the biggest risks or limitations of using AI in cancer care?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm very lucky to be part of a huge healthcare system, and so I have tons of patient data to train on. But at the same time, it's probably just representative of New England or patients that we see. Doesn't mean our models will necessarily generalize across any type of patient all around the world. So the very first limitation is generalizability. Does your model only work on the people who look like the people you tested it on and trained it on? Or can it actually generalize? And so we think about this a lot. You know, we have something called like a federated network, where essentially, because one of the other concerns is security, so what we end up doing is we figure out how to centralize the training, and we work with like about 8 other hospital systems, and we don't have to share the data, but we all train individually. Right now it's national. We're hoping that it can become international, but we have decent coverage across the United States to make sure that the models are generalizable. But that is a huge effort, right? So that's one major concern, is making sure your models actually work, and they're not biased. And then security. There's just tons of patient data, and you have to take that very serious, and you have to make sure you're doing everything in your power to protect it. So there's a lot, like I said, a lot of bioethics involved.
I want to touch on both of those. First, you were talking about, this concern about generalizability, this is something that happens in a lot of medical studies, that a treatment or some sort of drug might be tested on a particular population and then not work in terms of its toxicity or the way it's metabolized in another population. So this comes to another question. Could AI help reduce inequalities in cancer treatment, or might it make them worse if the data is biased?
That's a great question. So it absolutely will make it worse if you're not training correctly. So it kind of touches upon the question right before that it's our responsibility to make sure it's generalizable, that we test it across different populations to actually see that it's working, understand when it's failing to work before we make claims that it's a perfect model. I don't think there's such things as perfect model. In fact, any student who's ever shown me a model that works 100%,
you're suspicious.
No, that's overfit. Go back. I want to see some room for error because it's very unrealistic. So we do have to try very hard to make sure it's not biased, or it will cause issues. And so we try very hard to make sure we test our models across other different hospital systems. Again, I don't think it'll be amazing until we can tap into world level, like international level data. So it can do some damage, and we're going to have to be responsible with how we tell people how to use it and when to use it. But a lot of it comes to the actual training. Make sure your model sees all types of data.
The other concern you mentioned was data privacy. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, are you using a system like Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, or are you creating kind of a bespoke artificial intelligence architecture for your work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We're actually banned from using those types of models because there are some laws, like HIPAA laws.
Which ones? The ones that are out there?
The ones that are out there. Claude and ChatGPT, anybody would get fired if they ever put real patient data at a hospital. If you work at a hospital and you put real patient data into one of those models, they're just not secure models. Nor do they claim to be. They don't claim to be secure enough to handle a real patient's data. So we do build our models in-house. Our hospital system, we're very lucky, they sort of knew this was going to be something people wanted, so there's a lot of infrastructure where we built our own internal large language model. But again, most of my data isn't just text, so I build in-house models for videos, for images, for pathology slides. So it's all in-house, it's very different, but that's also against the law, technically, to put patient data into some of those. It's just like before you had AI chatbots, could you Google a patient's information? You could never do that either.
What's the trade-off between not being able to access the power of these larger AI systems and the specificity that you require in your own work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of these bigger models are general models. You could think of them as foundation models. They're trained on a lot of data. They can do a lot of things really well. But we're more interested in fine-tuned models. So we like them to carry out very specific tasks because we want to rely on them and we want to test that specific task to ensure that it's not biased, that it's very generalizable. So there's always trade-offs, but at the end of the day, you really want a super fine-tuned model to carry out what you're claiming. If you try and ask ChatGPT when something's going to recur, it'll give you a decent ballpark based on all its training data, but it's a lot different than the models we trained that have seen millions of just that data. So it's all about fine-tuning. There's definitely trade-offs, though. Those models are very powerful.
this is one that came in. With AI models based on existing data for drug development, is it possible for it to think outside the box to develop particularly unique drugs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we train these models on natural science, meaning the physics and the chemistry of how these interactions occur. That's all known information. It's not like we needed to reinvent chemistry for us. We can use generative AI to naturally develop a compound that can fit into a new pocket, but it looks super cool, and it's novel, and it's, again, generative AI, meaning it's generated it on its own, but it still is based on the historical knowledge and just the knowledge in textbooks. So, there is a little bit of confusion with thinking we're at a point now where AI is really coming up with anything brand new or on its own, but really under the hood, it's still just pattern recognition. It's not really reasoning, it's not really general intelligence, not like a human has. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really good question.
Yeah. I want to go back to this point you made earlier about knowing or not knowing. And I think that's, it reminds me of the early days when certain genes associated with a disease were identified, and individuals within a family where it could be inherited were given the opportunity to know if they were going to develop something or not. And so I'm wondering how you think about the power and the peril of knowing, of knowledge, especially when it comes to, say, knowing perhaps ahead of time that you might develop it, and then once you do develop it, what courses of action or what the future might look like. How do you think about that? How do you talk about that with people who are undergoing perhaps some of these treatments?
That's a great question. Like I said, when I first started out, I was very naive. I thought everybody wanted to know everything, and then you learn very quickly talking to people. It's not always the case. So I kind of learned to view it in we keep saying things like it's going to offer personalized medicine, and that the true nature of personalized medicine will also mean doing what that actual patient wants. So how can it really be personalized if you don't understand what that patient's, goal of care is or what that patient wants? So now with some of the trials we run where we're testing some of these like AI apps in the clinic, I actually give them a survey first to figure out what they want. Do they want to see a risk score? Some of it is maybe better kept with just the doctors. So I feel like if it's really going to be personalized, then you have to understand the patient in front of you and tailor whatever information you're giving them to their goals of care. So I learned that the hard way, that you can't make assumptions that everybody wants to know everything. So the true definition of personalized medicine takes that into account as well. Don't ever make assumptions, just ask.
When you say personalized in the context of cancer, do you mean that the disease is different, like is really different between each individual? And so current treatments of chemo and radiation and other drugs, that they just are, they're too generic or they're too blunt for what the disease is presenting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way it works now is we see an effect, we test it on patients, we see tumor shrinkage or even clearance in some patients, and that's amazing, because even if you can give a patient 3 months of life back, that's amazing. It's
Sorry, this is
life.
with the AI treatment?
No, this is with current treatment. With current therapies and sort of how we run clinical trials today.
Yeah.
But even when we look at the clinical trial data, we often see that it fails, like that this one-size-fits-all doesn't actually fit everybody, that there are failures. Some people fail, or maybe they'll experience some type of remission, but then the cancer comes back. And so we live in a world now where it's pretty great. We can try to come up with some biomarkers that can predict who's likely to respond, who's not likely to respond. But cancer's just so data heavy that it rarely is just one biomarker. And that's where AI can help us. It's very rare that only one thing can tell you whether or not a patient's going to respond or not. And so the future is actually taking the holistic approach, looking at very many different scales of the cancer, again, from their DNA all the way to the person and their environment, and then really creating models that predict which of these drugs will work. And then I said in the very hopefully closer, but in the future, we can actually develop the drugs that that specific patient needs that their tumor will likely respond to.
Is cancer different from something like the flu, say, because it's being generated uniquely by our individual bodies? What makes it?
That's
what makes
a great
it unlike
question.
The flu, or?
So the flu is infectious. It can obviously mutate on its own as well, but cancer's so different in everybody's body. You know, I remember I'm also like, one of my focuses is skin cancer. And I remember the first time I learned about spontaneous regression of some cancer. So there's this type of skin cancer that sometimes you see, you never actually see it on the skin, you only see it in a patient's lymph node. And that's when I learned that some people's immune system is so strong, it actually cleared that skin cancer. So even when we do the full skin checks, we could never see that original tumor. Their own immune system cleared it, and then it comes back and it's in their lymph node. So that's just so unique. Think about what has had to happen to that specific person's cancer, that somehow their body managed to get rid of it, and then it still had to create a new way to outsmart that person's immune system. That's a complete different evolutionary tract of that cancer than someone who it always stayed in their skin and maybe their own immune system couldn't clear it. So it's just little tiny bits of evolution happening at a tiny scale, but also kind of a massive scale with what goes on. I mean, like I said, I've never sequenced 2 tumors and ever saw them exactly identical. So how can we really expect the treatment to be exactly identical? So it's very different than infectious disease. They do mutate for survival reasons, but cancers also mutate for survival reasons, but it's just a much different scale.
Emily asks, can you talk a little bit about the specific protein targets you're studying in your lab?
So I can't.
Okay.
Because of
Sorry, Emily.
It's okay, it's a great question. Because of intellectual property reasons. But I can talk in general about sort of the field, and they are what are called intrinsically disordered proteins. We've known that they contribute to many diseases. We've known that they can cause cancer, but they don't typically fold in a way we could predict. Before AI, the way that proteins folded, we would tell through X-ray crystallography or NMR. But with the power of AI, even these proteins that really don't have such a fixed shape, we're able to get better data off of them and create drugs now for the first time ever. So we like to think of these proteins as traditionally undruggable because they weren't really tractable. And AI has sort of allowed us to enter this new field. So I could say that some of the protein targets are ones that we've known forever cause cancer. We just couldn't really do anything about it. We couldn't drug them. But no, I can't talk about the specific targets.
These are proteins that the tumors generate on their own?
Yeah, these are, you could think of them as master regulators of cancer. They tend to be these signals that basically just say grow, grow, grow. And if you have a signal that's constantly telling a cell to grow, it will learn to outsmart most drugs you throw at it. You know, even if you have a drug that kind of works, as soon as it'll turn on even more. And most of these cancers have come up with 10, maybe even 15 different ways to evolve to turn on some of these master regulators. Not just one, but very many different backups because they become addicted to these proteins.
I'm curious what the experience is like. Like you said, we've known for years about these quote-unquote undruggable targets, and then you're using these AI approaches in order to try to figure out a different way forward, and an AI might come up with a new approach to make it druggable. What is it doing? Is it finding a chink in the armor of this thing that we weren't able to see before? Is it better at finding a way structurally in order to interact with the protein? What have you noticed about what AI is doing that we weren't able to do before?
That's a great question. So again, because some of these undruggable proteins don't really have one shape, they tend to change their shape depending on their environment. What AI has helped us do is lock in a specific environment to understand that shape in that situation, and then drugging it becomes a lot easier. But because we never could really figure out how these folded, we never had that type of information. So AI is allowing us to predict that with pretty high accuracy. And then again, you always have to test it in the real world. You can't just trust what's in the computer. You always have to bring it into the real world. But it's been very accurate, like at an alarming rate.
You mean that you take one compound that freezes the protein in a particular conformation and then you drug it?
That's correct. Yeah.
I think there was a Deep Space Nine Star Trek episode where they
Yes, there
froze
was.
a shapeshifter in order to try to outsmart him. But he was a good guy.
He was a good guy.
Yeah, Odo. We had another question saying, what would meaningful success for AI in cancer care look like 10 years from now? I don't know, maybe you don't even have to go out that far. Maybe it's just a few years from now.
Yeah, I would say that it would have to be very personalized, that we could bring a patient in. Hopefully, actually, the best future would be that no one ever gets cancer, because we're actually detecting it so early that we have an intervention very early on, right? So the goal is always to avoid the disease in the first place. But if we don't get there in the next 10 years, because even if we're able to detect it early, we might not always have the best interventions. I do think that the future is going to be being able to design drugs that that specific patient needs. It's just we don't always understand today how, we can't predict how everybody's tumor is going to adapt, resist the drugs we're throwing at it. But think about it, if you have a digital twin of everybody's tumor and you know exactly what's going to happen, you can predict the next 6 things that you have to give the patient that won't harm the patient, because you also have AI models for the toxicity. And so I think that's what the future will look like. It will look like very specific cocktails of therapies. And as I said, manufacturing has to work with us too, because you need the prices to come down. We've got to be able to do this on an individual patient level, and it's got to become standard of care. Right? It always has to become the thing you routinely get done. So that's, I think, what the future looks like.
These are great. We got so many questions. They're terrific. Someone wrote, currently AI seems to be used mainly for cancer detection and drug discovery. Do you think AI could also be used to accurately monitor treatment response and safety during or after treatment, helping clinicians adjust therapies in real time?
Yes. So I think that's an actual current application that we have now is the real-time monitoring to get patients in a lot earlier when we predict there is going to be a resistance or if a toxicity is likely to occur. So real-time monitoring is probably going to become standard of care in the next 5 years, because why not? I do think that type of information really is powerful. I also think that when it comes to drug discovery, hopefully, I'm hoping we'll just start to be able to deliver a lot more drugs faster. So that's the other advantage there.
Mm-hmm. Someone wrote, why have no AI first drugs been clinically approved yet?
I think there are a couple in phase 1 trials. It's a very interesting market. I think a lot of these early startup companies that are using AI and their AI models for drug discovery had to still be kind of risk averse. So they would go after protein targets that we traditionally could drug anyway, just to show proof of concept. I think where you'll see the real big leap is when we're trying to do something different and we're designing drugs that don't exist like any current drug out there. And that always takes time because the FDA is going to want to see more data on something that's doing a completely different mechanism of action. So it'll take time. But most of what's being tested in phase 1 or phase 2 trials are pretty promising. But yeah, nothing has been FDA approved to my knowledge.
I want to go back to what you said about the freezing of these shape-shifting proteins and then drugging them. Did that solution, did that surprise you? I mean, surprise or like maybe awe you at all, or when you saw that fall out of the computer?
Yes, I have to say, because these are just intrinsically disordered. They don't really, you can't really lock them into place. It's why we just know that they can sort of almost have very many different shapes that they take. But again, it was always a data problem. It was always, and being able to predict so many different things is exactly what AI can do. It doesn't just predict one thing the way like the X-ray crystallography might do. So it was definitely surprising, but now looking back, everything always seems easy in retrospect, right? But it is really revolutionary.
I'm wondering what that experience is like when you saw it. You're like, oh, why didn't we think of that? Or I mean, are you saying it's sort of an obvious thing to do in retrospect?
It's an obvious thing to do in retrospect, but I tend to always be guarded. So when I first saw it, I didn't believe it. I don't believe it until I test it in the real world. And then I'm like, oh, wow, it really did it. And that's when I get excited. So again, you have to be responsible with what's coming out of your AI models. But until I see it in the real bench, that's when I have my, oh, wow, this is going to really make a difference moment.
A lot of folks express concerns about AI and fears around AI. And I'm wondering, like, how do you see AI? I mean, do you see it as kind of like a colleague or a partner or a loyal pet? I mean, how do you view it?
I don't view it as a pet. I do view it as, I think I do sometimes view it as an assistant, as like somebody that can help you with your research. Again, you have to be very responsible. Actually, I had a very interesting chat earlier, and I don't want to get in trouble for this, but I do think most people who've gained expertise in what they're doing will be fine, because they'll be able to critically assess whatever a model tells them. If ChatGPT says something to them, they might already have domain expertise and be able to take that with a grain of salt, say this is really right, or no, that doesn't sound right, and so they'll be able to assess it, like you should with any information coming your way. But I am worried that if people tend to do cognitive offload and trust it too much, then we lose that critical ability to really analyze it. And so I do view it as an assistant, but you always have to, you cannot use it to just have cognitive offload. So you always have to be very, very, very critical. And I think that's the key. Use it as an assistant, use it to help you, but you have to still be the critical thinker in the room.
Here's a question from someone who said, for those of us in the audience who have cancer or have had cancer or have an increased risk of future cancer, when can we expect to see this revolutionary care, and what can we do to accelerate it?
So that's an amazing question. Most of these types of prediction models still have to be FDA approved as software as a medical device. So again, to do responsible AI, I can't just say this worked amazing on my patients in my hospital. We still have to test this, and then those tests may not be perfect, and then we have to come back and retrain. So it's all being figured out as we speak. I mean, we are really living in that moment where we're even figuring out how we're going to regulate these models. And then don't forget, as new data changes, if your model is learning, once patients are reacting or doctors are reacting to the models, that training data starts looking very different. So these are going to be adaptive models. So my hope is that we'll start seeing some of these very specific models in clinic within the next 2 years after appropriate FDA approval. But some of the ones that do more adaptive training, those may take a little bit longer because they'll need years of data to assess.
And what about the part of what folks can do to help accelerate it?
I would say if you can participate in any of the clinical trials. We're always looking for people. We're always looking to have more, patient basis. And some people don't want to participate in clinical trials, and some people really do, but the more the merrier. The more we get some of this tested, the quicker it gets approved.
Here's a question about physicians, and they're wondering what skills should current and future physicians develop to work effectively alongside these AI tools?
That's a great question. I think it really just comes down to remaining a domain expert in what you do. AI models can still get something wrong. I view AI as augmenting the physician, augmenting the clinician, meaning it will help them, maybe hopefully even take off some of the administrative burden, off their plate. But I don't think anyone should be fully relying on any of this and thinking they don't have to understand their field or what they're doing any less. Do they have to learn to code? I don't think so. But they are going to have to continue being critical thinkers. So it will just be a companion piece that works alongside them to help. Maybe it'll allow them to see, have more time with their patients instead of having to spend most of the time typing something up. So I do envision it making the patient-facing experience better, but everybody still has to be a critical thinker in the room.
Here's a question someone asked, what about treatment of rare cancers, where only limited data are available for AI models to be trained?
So that's a great question because I'm actually a person who spends a lot of my time thinking about rare cancers. It's kind of what I got my start in, was specifically rare cancers. And we have tricks. We have tricks to simulate data to expand the pool because, again, you're always limited by smaller sample sizes when they're rare cancers. But there are AI tricks in math, essentially, where we can increase the sample size and try and replicate and simulate that data. But it is always more challenging, but it's usually math. Math helps us account for that. But yes, I'm a person who thinks about rare cancers more often than not.
So you think you can use these tools to kind of bootstrap or extrapolate?
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can, just for a moment, broaden the picture a bit around just disease treatment more generally. I mean, you're talking about some of the hardest ailments to deal with when it comes to cancer. Do you get the sense that other fields of disease treatment and inquiry are looking to or might benefit from artificial intelligence?
Absolutely. So the world of infectious disease and antibiotics have already benefited from AI. So that world and space has already seen trying to use AI-developed drugs to help against those superbugs, the ones that have antibiotic resistance. In my institution, we're obviously multidisciplinary. We're also using it to try, because these models are so powerful, right? They are not distinguishing between cancer and other diseases with dysregulated proteins. So we're actually also using it to develop drugs for neurodegenerative diseases, as well as for hearing loss, surprisingly, which turned out to be really quite an interesting finding. And then we collaborate with other people who have their diseases of choice and the things that they think about every day. So yes, it goes far beyond cancer. Cancer is just my background and what I think about every day. But even in my own lab, these models have become so powerful, we're actually applying them to other diseases.
It's a huge phase shift across the discipline.
It really is. Yeah.
Mia asks, are you afraid the next generation of scientists will develop a dependency on AI that might stifle innovation, and how might we prevent this?
I am very worried about that. I am seeing that the AI slop, as we call it, is a real problem in academia. You know, we're seeing a lot more AI-generated papers coming out, and the younger people, this will be all they know. They'll grow up with AI, and it'll be their normal. I do think different universities are handling this in different ways. Some of them are saying absolutely not. Some of them are embracing it because it's going to be part of regular life. I'm not sure I have all the answers. I definitely think I'm very worried about it because, again, it's that cognitive offload. If you wake up and you're not using your own brain and you're just relying on it to write for you and think for you, then it will become smarter than you. But if you just stay critically thinking about whatever it is you choose to do with your life, it will always be a helpful assistant to you.
I know you do some teaching. How do you think about it in the classroom when you're working with young people to avoid the slop, to encourage people to work with it as a partner?
I actually, in their first year, don't allow it. I want to make sure you know how to code on your own, that you're using traditional methods of figuring out how to do it. And then once you demonstrate that, you kind of can start learning it. So, but I don't have all the answers. Some people are very aware of the fact that it makes mistakes because they already have that domain expertise established. But if you don't have that domain expertise established, you might just think everything it says is true. That's what I fear the most.
It's such a new technology.
It's a new
We haven't
technology.
quite figured out all of this yet, but it is here.
It is here. And it's here to stay.
And
it's
folks
not,
and folks are going to need to learn how to work with it and to use it responsibly.
That's exactly right.
Someone wrote, have you seen differences in these kind of shape-shifting proteins or perhaps other aspects of your work that differ between men and women, or maybe to broaden it, other kind of demographics?
That's a great question. I can't say that I have, per se, because I wasn't really asking those types of questions. I do have colleagues who are specifically asking those types of questions and seeing that there are, in fact, differences. Not from a protein level, But what we have noticed is that women and their immune system, and some of the data we've collected, tends to affect some of their cancers differently. So we are studying that more. So we're definitely seeing differences among some of the demographics, but you really do have to look for those patterns and ask those questions. But with the protein work, I tend to not think about the demographic unless we're including that entire scale that I showed you. And so with those multimodal models, then yes, it does come into play.
Someone's wondering about the environmental impact of the AI revolution, and wondering what you think about that and whether there's a way to continue to take advantage of these models while still being ecologically responsible.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things we think about. How do we do this responsibly? It's going to require some form of regulation, and while I do think the technology is here to stay, we do have to think about its impact and how it affects people living next to these data centers, how it impacts the environment. I don't really have all the answers. I do think it's going to require regulation, and there are, in fact, a lot of pros and cons to it. I like to live in the space where we just try to use it for human health, but the bigger the data centers, they're going to have some consequences, and so we need people thinking about that every day and figuring out how to handle it. So it's a little bit out of my expertise, but yes, I am very worried about it. I see a big problem coming our way with that.
We've got a couple minutes left, so if you've been sitting on a question that you want to ask, be sure to send it in. I'm wondering about some of these dead ends that you were, I mean, you talked about pipetting or do this work in the basement. I imagine windowless, of course that's what a basement is, underground, and when you're subterranean doing this, and how you were, a lot of these were just dead ends. I'm wondering, it seems like a big part of what AI can offer is to help guide you better in directing you towards what a better outcome is. Even though it needs to be validated, it saves on time, saves on expenses, and although it's also using a lot of energy, it's perhaps saving other types of resources.
That's a great point. So the best models we have been trained on data that includes the failures, because you always care about the successes, but you always want to learn from the failures as well, why these molecules failed, or even if they bound really well and they looked good in all the preclinical data, but then they really were toxic. You want all of that data to learn from it. And yes, while they can be resource intensive to run some of these models, I do like to think that at the end of the day, we are saving our time, energy, money, and labor from pursuing these drugs that are ultimately going to be failures. So the traditional drug discovery pipeline takes billions of dollars in years to get a drug finally into patients. And it has such a high failure rate at every single step. And so if we could reduce those failure rates, reduce the time, we could hopefully be producing a lot more effective drugs for the same amount of money.
Great. Someone was asking, can the AI models that you're using take context into account in what they're doing, like a person's medical history? You talked about all the different data streams. I imagine that's yes.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So some of the better models we build take far more than just one data type. So they actually consider everything, including the patient's actual environment and their goals of care, as I mentioned, where what does the patient actually want to know. So some of them are context aware. So we actually have a word for that. It's context aware. And we build a lot of models that way. Even some of our like toxicity models or some of our binding affinity models that we build take into account the actual type of assay and the context that you're going to be testing that drug in, like the pH and whatever. So I know you're asking about medical records, but yes, that's a very powerful way to model some of these AI tools.
Tracy Vu's curious, with genomic sequencing in cancer allowing so much data to be collected on a patient's, where did Tracy Vu go? Oh, well.
It sounded like a really good question.
It is. I know where it is in the order. I think as other questions, here we are. Tracy's back. With genomic sequencing allowing so much data to be collected on a patient's sequence, how does data noise impact AI models?
Oh, I love data noise. You always want noise in your model because you always need your models to decipher between real and noise. So noisy training data is actually okay. Because if you eventually want your model to work, you can't assume it's always going to have perfect data. But again, garbage in, garbage out. So you still want the majority of what the model to see to be pretty good. But noise is actually allowable in the models. Just like, think about a person, a bioinformaticist looking at the sequencing data. Anybody who's doing any analysis will always have to pick through the noise and the real signal. And you want your AI model to actually be able to do that too. So it's actually important.
And maybe finally, I'm wondering, for folks who are maybe interested in this as a professional trajectory for them or for people who they know in their lives who might be interested, what sort of advice would you give them about what they might do next or what they might look into?
It's a great question. I think if you're interested in coding and computer science, pursue that, because we still need people designing the next more powerful AI architectures. If you're interested in anything else, you still have to become familiar with these tools, because chances are these tools can help you with whatever your next steps in life are, whatever science, math, or engineering you're interested in. AI tools are probably going to stick around and help your field. But if you're interested in the coding, I know that in the future, I think everybody in this room will be able to code with just human language. But if you really want to build the next form of architecture for some of these models to bring us to that next step, that next revolutionary step, you still need to learn how to code. So it really just depends on what you want to do. If you're computer science oriented, you should still do it. If you're interested in neuroscience or some other STEM field, just be aware that AI is around and just start using these tools to help you, and keep critically thinking about whatever you're doing, and never have that cognitive offload where you expect the AI to do all the thinking for you.
Please join me in giving Sophia Shalhout a big round of applause for joining us tonight. Thank you very much, Sophia.
Thank you for everything.
Thanks to the Reno family for their support of tonight's event. And we invite you to join us at a reception in the back now. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.